Will Africa ever succeed to reclaim all its resources from the West? The West ruled over Africa's resources under the pretext that Africa couldn't handle them. But now that the benefits had been fully taken after Africans were left impoverished for years. By taking back its gold mines, Burkina Faso is enacting change. Nevertheless, Burkina Faso is predicted by the West to be unable to cope. Does that give the West the right to seize power, even if it doesn't? Let's investigate. Africa is no longer the quiet participant in world trade. It's making daring attempts to take center stage and shaking up the mining sector. Burkina Faso is the one who has raised the stakes today, warning the West that their time of pillaging Africa's resources is running out. Burkina Faso has seized Bungu and Wagnyon, two of its most profitable gold mines that were formerly owned by Western businesses, in a show of defiance. Burkina Faso has acquired ownership of the mines for a meager $80 million, along with a 3% royalty on up to 400,000 ounces of gold, despite the fact that the mines were expected to fetch over $300 million at auction. This is not just a business transaction. It's a sign that the continent of Africa is taking back command of its resources and disobeying the laws established by other forces. Given that Burkina Faso's nationalization has rocked the globe's gold market to its core, let us start by asking why this is happening right now. Why has Burkina Faso decided to nationalize its gold mines at this particular time? It is not by accident that Burkina Faso nationalized its gold mines at this particular time. It's a premeditated action that represents a paradigm shift in how Africa views its natural resources. Africa has endured far too long economic stagnation and environmental damage as a result of Western countries' exploitation of the continent and their ability to set terms for resource extraction. However, African countries are increasingly starting to reassert their agency. Burkina Faso's action is indicative of this expanding trend. Western companies have controlled Africa's most lucrative resources, gold, oil, diamonds, and rare minerals, for many years. African countries have only received a small portion of the income from these resources, which have been vital to Western economies. However, change-bringing winds are blowing throughout the continent. Furthermore, nations like Burkina Faso are fed up with serving as foreign powers' resource suppliers. The nationalization of the Bungu and Wagnyon mines by Burkina Faso is a blatant indication that the nation is taking control of its own future. Burkina Faso has pulled off a strategic coup by paying under $80 million for assets that were previously valued at over $300 million. The agreement is further sweetened by the addition of a 3% royalty on future gold production, which guarantees that the nation will continue to gain from its resources for many years to come. However, why now? The larger political and economic changes occurring throughout Africa hold the key to the solution. A growing number of people believe that African countries need to be in charge of their resources and not answer to multinational companies, a view known as resource nationalism. Nations such as South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania have already started to impose more authority on their resources. Burkina Faso's move to nationalize its gold mines is just one example of this broader movement. There are several things at play in this movement. First, African leaders are beginning to realize that the agreements made with Western companies throughout the post-colonial era were made with the West, not Africa, in mind. These agreements frequently forced African countries to participate in exploitative programs that provided Western companies control over enormous expanses of territory and resources in exchange for meager benefits. Second, African leaders feel compelled to break free from the decades-long cycle of reliance that has afflicted their continent. The enormous resources of Africa have the potential to propel economic expansion and development, but only on the condition that African countries manage them. By seizing command of its gold reserves, Burkina Faso is putting out a message. Africa will no longer allow foreign powers to use it as a playground. Ultimately, African countries now have more negotiating power with the West as a result of the emergence of new global players like China and Russia. By providing alternative investment and knowledge sources, these nations enable African states to expand their economic alliances and lessen their dependence on Western firms. Given this, nationalizing its gold mines is a sensible move toward increased economic independence for Burkina Faso. The nationalization of Burkina Faso is a daring move that upends the established order, but it also raises significant concerns about how it may affect the world gold market. How will the change in ownership impact the price of gold globally? What does that entail for investors in the West, as well as identity? Now let's go on. Gold has never been limited to use as a commodity. Investors seek refuge in this financial haven amid turbulent times. The whole market was thus alarmed when Burkina Faso nationalized two significant gold mines. Western investors are struggling to understand the new reality as a result of the abrupt ownership change, which is causing tremors in a market that is already delicate. The nationalization of Bungu and Wagnyon by Burkina Faso adds an unpredictable factor that investors find repulsive. Stability is essential to the global gold market, despite its volatility. Stability that Western-controlled operations in Africa have long supplied. Now that Burkina Faso has taken over two major gold mines, that stability is in doubt. The price of gold globally is probably going to be the first and most noticeable effect. Concerned about the production's ongoing trajectory, potential disruptions in supply are expected by investors, and this might lead to an increase in the price of gold. The supply and demand that drives the gold market means that any interruption in the supply chain can have a big impact on prices. Gold supplies could tighten globally if Burkina Faso is unable to sustain the production levels attained under Western administration. As a result, prices would rise as investors rush to buy gold in case there is a scarcity. But supply disruptions are just one aspect of the worries. Concerns over Burkina Faso's nationalization's long-term effects are also present among Western investors. Western companies have dominated the market for decades by maintaining control over the amount of gold that leaves Africa. However, now that Burkina Faso is in charge, that authority is eroding. Should other African countries adopt Burkina Faso's strategy, it might cause the world gold market to undergo a dramatic reconfiguration. Corporate America in the West is already under pressure. The nationalization of Wagnyon and Bungu could serve as a model for other African countries looking to recover sovereignty over their natural resources. And investors are uneasy about this possibility. Western companies have benefited from advantageous arrangements that have allowed them to take advantage of Africa's richness and give little in return for years. However, African countries are starting to retaliate today, and there are significant ramifications for the world market. The issue of investor confidence also exists. For a considerable time, Western companies have been regarded as the most dependable gold mining operators in Africa. They are equipped with the knowledge, resources, and capital to guarantee a flawless production process. However, there is a perception, whether true or not, that output levels may decline as African countries seize control. Investors are already nervous about Burkina Faso's ability to continue operating at the same level of efficiency as Western operators because of this impression. African countries are, of course, more than capable of managing their resources. Key sectors have been effectively nationalized by nations like Botswana and Namibia, which has led to notable economic growth. Simply said, Burkina Faso is the most recent in a long series of African countries demonstrating that they can manage their resources, as well as any Western firm, by seizing control of them. But there is legitimate anxiety among investors. They fear that other African countries would follow Burkina Faso's lead if its nationalization is effective. If a result, the West may have far less control over the world gold market if African countries start to set the rules for production and price. This is a nightmarish scenario for the West. one that poses a risk to their hegemony in the world economy. However, might this be the start of a more widespread trend? Is Africa about to see a full-fledged resource revolution? Though it may appear to be an isolated event, Burkina Faso's decision to nationalize its gold mines is actually a part of a much bigger trend that is sweeping across Africa. African countries have been ensnared in abusive agreements with Western firms for many years. Contracts that gave these firms enormous wealth extraction power in exchange for minimal compensation. The nationalization of Bungu and Wagnyon is merely the most recent instance of Africa's growing pattern of resistance, though. The idea behind this movement, called resource nationalism, is that African countries ought to be in charge of their resources and utilize them for the good of their citizens. It is a denial of the colonial-era agreements that have maintained Africa's reliance on outside forces. And it serves as a proclamation of independence from the continent's economic hegemony held by the West. Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and South Africa are just a few nations that have started to exercise more control over their natural resources. Burkina Faso's decision to nationalize its gold mines is a part of this larger movement. These countries are no longer willing to watch helplessly while wealthy Western firms profit from their misery. They want to use their resources to support economic growth, and they want a more equitable portion of the earnings. Numerous causes are contributing to the emergence of resource nationalism. First, African leaders are beginning to realize that the agreements made with Western companies throughout the post-colonial era were made with the West, not Africa, in mind. Large expanses of land and resources were frequently given to Western firms as a result of these contracts, leaving African nations with nothing more than poverty and degraded environments. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by dropping a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's continue. Second, African leaders feel compelled to break free from the decades-long cycle of reliance that has afflicted their continent. Resources in Africa have the capacity to spur economic expansion and development, but only if they are controlled by African countries. Burkina Faso is expressing its intentions by seizing control of its gold mines. Africa will no longer allow foreign powers to use it as a playground. Ultimately, African countries now have more negotiating power with the West as a result of the emergence of new global players like China and Russia. By providing alternative investment and knowledge sources, these nations enable African states to broaden their economic alliances and lessen their dependence on Western firms. Given this, nationalizing its gold mines is a sensible move toward increased economic independence for Burkina Faso. However, this movement's effects extend beyond Africa. Should additional African countries adopt Burkina Faso's strategy, the world economy may undergo a substantial readjustment. With African states starting to set the conditions of resource extraction, Western firms, who have long depended on inexpensive access to African resources, may find themselves marginalized. This would entail a significant change in the balance of power on Earth. Africa has been ruled by the West for centuries, and its resources have been used to support its economic expansion. Africa is starting to retaliate now, though, and this has significant effects on the world economy. The global supply networks and the balance of power between the global North and South may change if African countries are successful in taking back control of their resources. The dynamics of power are starting to change globally as resource nationalism gains traction in Africa. But how will this threat be met by the West? The gold mines of Burkina Faso were nationalized. It's not only a business venture, it's an earthquake of geopolitics. Africa has been ruled by the West for centuries, with the continent's resources under its control and its economies fueled by this richness. However, Africa is now resisting, and the West is having to face the idea that it might not be able to take advantage of the continent in the same way that it has in the past. The possible realignment of international alliances is one of the major geopolitical ramifications of Burkina Faso's nationalization. The most important resources on the continent are controlled by Western firms, and African states have been economically integrated with the West for many years. However, as new funding sources such as China and Russia become available, African countries are starting to search outside for economic alliances. China has been particularly active in Africa, providing loans, infrastructure projects, and knowledge in return for being granted access to the continent's resources. China, in contrast to the West, has been open to more advantageous negotiations, giving African countries more authority over their natural resources. Because of this, China has become a desirable partner for many African countries, and resource nationalism is probably going to make these relationships stronger. Russia has also been increasing its footprint in Africa, especially in the energy and mining industries. Russia is making a name for itself in the African resource industry by offering good bargains and having experience in resource exploitation. African countries will probably keep cementing their alliances with China and Russia as they start to take more ownership of their resources, so reducing the influence of the West on the continent. It is improbable that the West will accept the change tacitly. Western nations have been relying on the resources of Africa to propel their economies for generations, and they won't give up that power without a struggle. Western governments have already been known to put diplomatic and financial pressure on African countries who want to nationalize their resources, and it seems probable that these strategies will be used in the future. Additionally, military intervention is an option. Given the high stakes, it's not impossible that we will witness a return of military interventions meant to get access to Africa's resources. The West has a long history of employing military force to defend its interests in Africa. The West has repeatedly demonstrated that it is prepared to go to considerable lengths in order to safeguard its access to African resources, whether through proxy conflicts, coups, or outright action. Global trade could be reshaped by the development of resource nationalism. African countries may decide to prioritize economic links with other growing powers when they seize control of their resources, such as Russia and China, despite their historical connections to the West. Global supply networks may reorganize as a result, with Africa taking on a more significant role in international resource markets. This is a nightmarish scenario for the West. Economic instability could result from Western firms being compelled to renegotiate contracts and pay greater rates for the commodities they once harvested cheaply if they lose control over African resources. The West's geopolitical clout may be weakened as African countries start to side with other world powers. Africa is starting to take more authority over its resources, which is changing the geopolitical environment. But there are big challenges that come along with this greater authority. Can African countries adequately manage the resources they have nationalized? Regaining authority over its resources is just the beginning of Africa's path to economic freedom. For nations such as Burkina Faso, the true test is in efficiently allocating these resources. Although nationalization makes a strong political statement, there are serious hazards involved. Inadequate management of nationalization can result in inefficiency, corruption, and a decrease in output, all of which could be detrimental to the very objectives that the program is meant to accomplish. A major obstacle to managing nationalized resources in African countries is a lack of infrastructure and experience. Western companies have been in charge of extracting, processing, and exporting Africa's resources for many years. They have also built the necessary infrastructure and knowledge to do this effectively. Now that African countries are in charge, they need to strengthen their ability to oversee these sectors. This will necessitate large investments in technology, education, and infrastructure. The knowledge and abilities required to run sophisticated businesses like mining, oil extraction, and refining will need to be developed by African countries. In order to transport and export these resources, they will also need to make investments in the ports, railroads, and roads that are necessary. Corruption is yet another significant issue. Resource riches has always favored a small elite, rather than the general populace in many African countries. Widespread corruption and a lack of accountability in resource management are the results of this. African governments must take action to make sure that the money obtained from resources is put toward improving the nation's infrastructure, healthcare, and educational institutions, rather than being embezzled by dishonest officials if nationalization is to actually benefit the populace. Another worry is political stability. Given the West's lengthy history of interfering in African politics, there is a genuine chance that they will try to topple African countries who want to nationalize their natural riches. Economic penalties, diplomatic pressure, or even military involvement could be used to achieve this. To defy outside pressure, African countries will need to maintain their vigilance and strive to fortify their political structures. There is cause for hope in spite of these obstacles. Numerous African countries have previously proven that they are capable of managing their resources well. Key sectors have been nationalized in nations like Botswana and Namibia, and as a result, their economies have grown significantly. These countries have demonstrated that African countries are capable of managing their resources just as well as any Western company, given the correct leadership and financial support. Burkina Faso is capable of being successful as well. The nation has already shown that it is prepared to make significant strides toward economic independence. And with the correct educational and infrastructure investments, it can develop the capacity required to efficiently run its gold mines. Burkina Faso could serve as a role model for other African countries looking to recover control over their natural resources if it can successfully negotiate the difficulties that lie ahead. Do you believe that recovering resources is warranted at this time? Can Africa effectively oversee its resources? After this decision by Ibrahim Traore, do you think Burkina Faso will write its own history? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed, you're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.